Thank you everyone for joining me for tonight's One Night Stand presentation. This is a series of presentations that we do at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, where we focus on one work of art and one artist for one night. Tonight, I'll be discussing Shelby Lee Adams' Peggy and Albert Campbell from 1999. It is a gelatin silver print, and it was purchased by the museum in 2002. It's currently on view in the exhibition All Dressed Up and Down, Depictions of Clothing in the Collection, which is on view until May 18th. So still a little while to see this piece in person. Shelby Lee Adams is known for his photographs of the residents of rural Appalachia. They've been the subject of an exhaustive photographic survey that's been his primary focus throughout the majority of his career. And so here we're seeing an example of that work. Peggy and Albert Campbell are from this area that he focuses on in rural Appalachia. And here we're seeing them out on their land in a full-length portrait here, kind of very traditional, really, in their pose and in the way that we're seeing them. She's wearing this patterned kind of house dress with a polka dot pattern. There is a little bobble up at the top for the zipper there to kind of go up and down. Very simple black shoes. You'll notice that on her wrist, slid up her arm just a little bit, is what might be a watch or a bracelet. Her hair is pulled back. She has kind of an austere face as well. Not a lot of humor coming through in her expression there. And then Albert is wearing this jacket, kind of an undershirt, jeans, a belt, black boots, his trucker cap on his head, and his sunglasses. He holds a dog in his arms, and the black and white coloring of the dog almost seems to blend in with the black and white of his shirt and jacket. There are chickens on the ground as well, kind of walking by along behind them. And then very strikingly, drawing our focus to their faces and really kind of highlighting them, bringing in our attention. We've got them almost haloed by this large satellite dish right behind them. And the curator who purchased this piece for the museum remarked in emails with the gallery that they were talking with that it looks a little bit like an Appalachian version of Grant Wood's American Gothic, or a satellite Gothic, if you will. And somewhat similar to Wood, Adams is also creating a very personal portrait, a very personal representation of what he saw as something that was kind of vanishing, that was in the process of change. It was a world that he wanted to both celebrate, record, and also mourn in a way as well. And all of this he wanted to do very carefully, very delicately in his work. The artist has said, quote, "I love these people. I respond to the sensual beauty of a hardened face with many scars, the deeply etched lines and flickers of sweat containing bright spots of sunlight," end quote. So all of this was very important and very personal to him. Let's get a little bit into his background and see some other photos, and then we'll come back around to this piece. So Shelby Lee Adams was born in 1950 in Hazard, Kentucky, in the eastern part of the state. His grandfathers on both sides lived and farmed in rural Appalachia, in these communities called hollers. Hollers were extremely isolated areas, and the people that lived there often wanted to do things not the way that other people were doing them in the contemporary era. They wanted to live off the land. They relied a lot on subsistence farming, a very independent, very kind of individualistic way of life. These hollers were typically 10 to 15 miles long, and there would be houses along the way. So he's been very familiar with these communities, even in his childhood. And he's also very familiar with the many ways that people can feel about the area. And that's something that comes up in his work as well, with the different feelings that these artworks evoke in people when they see them. Adams graduated from the Cleveland Art Institute in 1973, and he finished his MA in photography at the University of Iowa in 1974. And it's in that year, in 1974, that he considers kind of the start of this work, the start of his Appalachian photography project. He doesn't consider himself a documentarian or a photojournalist. That's not how he was trained. He was trained in art school as an artist. And so he isn't concerned with maintaining a distance between himself and his subjects. He doesn't make any claims to objectivity in his work either. And so his work often ends up occupying this interesting space between art and documentary photography. He's also completed multiple book projects, and his work has been collected by many major museums. He now lives in Massachusetts, and he had been working as a college professor and a commercial photographer, along with going into these communities in Kentucky to photograph. But he's now retired, and so he can focus entirely on his darkroom and his photographic work. Most recently, he's created a new book project from the heads of the Hollers, which was re-examining his archive from 1974 to 2010 and including unpublished photos within this book. So as you might imagine, he's amassed quite an archive of images over that time. So things that influenced Adams as he was kind of coming up in art school while he was at the Cleveland Institute of Art, he was exposed to the photographs of the Farm Security Administration, which documented the effects of the Great Depression on the American South in the 1930s. So people like Walker Evans there on the left, Arthur Rothstein on the right, Dorothea Lange on the left, and Gordon Parks on the right. All of these would have been artists that he was familiar with, and they've all had an impact on him. Their approach to photographs like this, their approach to going into communities and photographing them, was something that Adams would have been intimately familiar with. And even before this period as well, he also looked to artists like Louis Hine, um, and his photographs of workers and documenting working conditions of the time as well. So all of these things would have been present in mind for him. He would have known about them, had them in mind. But his work is somewhat different in that he's photographing the people amongst whom he was raised. Here you're seeing his self-portrait with his grandma from 1974. And he often goes back time and time again and photographs the same families, visiting them at their homes, down these isolated hollers, photographing them year after year. If they're not already friends and relatives, they become friends over all of this time that he's spending with them. He's commented that they accept him because he accepts them. So there is this kind of reciprocal relationship between them. And it's built on a lot of trust that he has to build up. He also doesn't shy away from depicting difficult subject matter. He's not concerned about romanticizing or idealizing his subjects. And that too can provoke different reactions within people when they see these photographs. He typically uses a large format camera to register details more clearly. Today, he's used multiple different cameras throughout his career, but for these black and white photographs that he's typically known for, he's most often using this 4x5 large format camera with a Polaroid back and a tripod. And this allowed not only for clarity in the photos, but also transparency with his subjects as well. It's not a little camera that he's taking snapshots with. This is a very visible, fairly large camera. And so they can always see where the camera is at all times. They're aware of what's happening. They're aware of how he's positioning himself in order to take those photographs. He also uses artificial lighting in his photos. As we talked about, he doesn't consider himself a documentarian, and so he's not really after a purist aesthetic. He's perfectly fine with altering the environment through the addition of those lights. And it makes for an environment where he can take a little more creative risks. He can bring light into this sort of documentary environment, and it ends up creating environments that can be quite majestic, haunting, and theatrical as well. So Brothers Praying from 1993 is a good example of where he positions us as the viewer often in these photographs. We're often very close. We're kind of intimately connected to the subjects. It can be a little shocking and jarring for the viewer when they see these photographs because you are so close up. You're really put into someone else's space. And you almost feel like you're intruding on a very personal, very kind of private moment, especially here with this moment of brothers praying. And it also demonstrates this level of trust between the photographer and his subjects, that he's allowed to really get in there and depict these moments of their lives. Um, and he's trying to share with us as the viewer this very intimate experience. He wants us to feel like we're experiencing it as well. His subjects do often find his portrayals of their lives accurate, respectful, and true. That may be because of that almost painful intimacy, or even in spite of that intimacy that's created. But for the most part, they're quite happy with the way that these photographs come out. And what Adams is really looking for in his choice of subjects is he's looking for authentic representations of families that remind him of the families that he saw growing up in this area. And so the couple that you're seeing pictured here, John and Bertha Napier, are an example of that kind of family. He felt that they were very authentic to people that he remembered from his childhood. He first met them in 1985. They were at the head of one of these hollers, which is kind of the most isolated area of the holler. There are 4 or 5 little houses that were clustered there. John on the left was kind of a mountain man. He farmed the land. Berthie on the right was kind of right there along with him, also working the land, working incredibly hard, doing all of these different jobs, cooking and cleaning as well, and also has a lot of kind of spirit and spunk and dignity that she brought to the environment as well. And you get the impression in seeing the photographs that Berthie holds a special place for Adams in his photographic work. He seems to have been very captivated by her um, in just the photos that he's taking. Berthie and John had 16 children. And so Adams would also photograph the subsequent generations, the children, their children, as they would go on. And with these different families, he would often end up photographing 3, 4 generations of a family over this span of time that he's been working on this project. Um, I mentioned before that he didn't shy away from the harder aspects of the lives of his subjects, and that's true here as well. Um, there were a lot of tragedies that struck this family. Alcoholism and violence played a role in some of these different tragedies. And Adams had created a close enough relationship that he's also present in those moments of tragedy and in their aftermath as well at things like funerals. So you're seeing an example here of Dan Napier's funeral, one of the sons of John and Berthie. And John is there looking at the camera too. Um, so he's here, he's capturing these, again, very intimate, very private moments, but he's invited in. He's created this sense of trust that then allows the viewer to come in with him and sees what's happening within these spaces. I mentioned that he has this kind of special affinity for Berthie, and I think that comes through in this portrait of her from 1988. And you're seeing a little behind the scenes there of her being photographed on the right. But the quote from the beginning where he's thinking about the lines on someone's face and the story that they tell and how connected he is to that, that comes through a lot in his work, and especially in this piece of Berthie here as well. And he decided to end his photographic essay of the Napiers with Berthie's death. So he went to Berthie Napier's funeral and he photographed at the funeral in 1998. But he stopped kind of professionally photographing them at that point. He did continue to visit them. He continued to make pictures and take pictures, but it wasn't serious photography. It was more about maintaining that relationship with the family. And here again, with a different family and this home funeral in Leatherwood, Kentucky in 1990. Again, an incredibly private moment, but you're being brought in. These intimate moments of people's lives. He's bringing you into that space and kind of showing you what's happening. And it is a very sophisticated photograph that he's created here. Um, Keep in mind that he's making choices throughout this entire process. He's figuring out the composition. He's carefully considering the composition and how he wants things to be placed, how he wants himself to be placed as the photographer, the angle that he wants to take on the scene. And here you've got this really compelling image where he's sort of in the doorway and you're able to see that wall that's going down the center there, but you can see into two different rooms. And the figures that are present in those rooms, the expressions on their faces, the textures, the patterns that are present within the work, the pages of that calendar that are kind of ruffled up and you can just see a little bit of the edge. All of that creates this incredibly compelling image and also giving you a sense of this experience, this reality of a home funeral. It becomes a portrait of a family and a culture, but also because it is so personal and so special to him, it becomes like a self-portrait as well. Something where he's bringing together his conscious and his subconscious too into these images. Another large family that he photographed, the Sloan family on top of the mountain where they lived. This is another of these families where he probably photographed them for 4 generations, just again and again, kind of seeing people as they grew up. And this was a family where they really had this love for individualism and their independence and this space that allowed them to live that kind of life that they wanted to live. As he spends all this time photographing these generations, he also sees the changes that take place over time. And so he saw the children's lifestyles become much more affected by TV and media, and that brought changes to how they lived their lives, to the things that were present around them, to the types of homes that they lived in. And it was something that he resisted photographing for a while. He was really interested in those very traditional families, what he saw as being authentic to his childhood and his growing up. But he soon came to realize that if he was only photographing those very traditional families, pretty soon he would run out of people to photograph because those changes just take place. And so then you get into photos that he talks about as being a little bit more modern Appalachia. So this one's coming a little later from 2007, but thinking about the trailer homes that started being seen, the plastic swimming pools that would be in the yard, these different elements that were impacting the life and the culture of these rural Appalachian communities. And that kind of modern Appalachia time starts in this 1999 to 2001 era, which also includes the photo that we started with, Peggy and Albert Campbell. So with this idea, he's starting to think about people who are starting to move out of the hollers, reflecting a new idea of Appalachia. Adams was finding that his subjects were less likely to live off the land, more likely to embrace media culture. They started to reflect kind of a fancier style of dress. Mobile homes started appearing, like I mentioned, with increasing frequency. And of course, as pictured in this photograph, the satellite dishes that began to dot the landscape. And here he's using it to great effect as this kind of haloing feature, as a way to sort of silhouette these two figures against the rest of their landscape. Um, Later on, into the 2000s and the 2010s, he does start to work in color digital photography as well and starts to bring that element into his work. And we're seeing two examples of that here with Martha and Kizzy in Pink Room from 2008 and Preacher Dillard from 2012. And you can see how it adds a whole nother element to the photographs and to our impression of these people and their lives. It creates an entirely different tone and a different way for us to look and experience these communities that he was looking at. He's often working amongst these people who are very often stereotyped by mainstream culture. And he's trying to kind of buck against that. He wants us to get a sense of their complexity, of their dignity, of their humor as well. So he creates these compelling images Sometimes they may be difficult to see, they may be difficult and might make you want to turn away from them. But at the same time, he's able to express vulnerability in his subjects while also maintaining and preserving their dignity as well. I mentioned that his photographs could be controversial. And there's a good documentary called The True Meaning of Pictures, Shelby Lee Adams Appalachia. And it does a nice job of including Shelby Lee Adams, but also his subjects. It includes interviews with them and critics as well. And so you're hearing from a lot of different voices who are looking at these photographs. And so some of the critics that are talking there, we get the sense that these photographs could be controversial. People disagree on how the culture should be represented, how it should be portrayed to a broader public, and what it tells people when these photographs go out to the public. And so some people see these photographs that Adams was taking as being exploitive. Um, in the documentary, the mayor of Hazard, Kentucky is interviewed and he's quoted as saying, "Poverty sells." So he has a very kind of critical eye on what Adams is doing, thinking about it in that way. But Adams is very aware of this. He's very conscious of this. And it's something that he is quite careful about. He remembers his own experience as a teenager during kind of the war on poverty era, where Adams would see media outlets come to his hometown to document the poverty of the area. And the portrait that was created and presented to a broader public was one of a malnourished and poor populace. And the people that were featured in the reporting, the subjects of the reporting, felt that they had been misled about what those reporters were doing. They didn't like the final product, they didn't think it was accurate to their experience, and they felt misled about how everything was done. So that really had a profound impact on Shelby Lee Adams. And so it's something that he's tried to take to heart in his own process. And he knows too, for his own work, if a family has had a bad experience with another filmmaker or a photographer, he will never have access to them either. Even if there's good buzz about him from other people that this family knows, if they've had a bad experience, they'll never work with him. So it's something he's very aware of and very conscientious of. He sees himself as trying to right what the media has done before him. So it's something that he's actively trying to work against, and yet still his photographs are seen sometimes in this light that he could be playing into stereotypes or exploiting his subjects. And one of the photographs, one of the earliest photographs that gets pointed to is this photo of Berthy with a pipe and her husband John in 1992. So critics of this piece said it was stereotyping, said it was manipulating his subjects, that he was playing into these stereotypes that existed. And they said that because of things like Al Cap's Lil Abner cartoons, which characterized mountain people as these kind of hillbilly characters. And there was an elderly woman character who was always smoking on this pipe. And so, of course, as someone saw this, they said, oh, he's playing into that idea, this stereotype that already existed. And that was something that was not in Adam's mind at all at the time when he took this photo. Berthy had been smoking the pipe quite naturally, and he felt that it was quite traditional. It was something that he remembered old women doing, was smoking on their pipes. Um, but the criticism did cause him to take a harder look at the culture and the history and some of these different things that existed, so that he would be more aware of them. He has talked about how he's not trying to exploit stereotypes, but rather showing the reality, the limitations, and the happiness that can exist within these communities. For critics, though, they look at these pieces and say it's a photograph, it's telling a story, but the reader is left to imagine what that story is. And so, of course, they will bring to their imagining those, 100 years of stereotypes of the hillbilly, and that will impact how they read the photograph. So different perceptions of how these photos are understood and can exist in media. Another photo that's been a bit controversial is the hog killing, again with the Napier family from 1990. This piece connects to Adam's upbringing on his grandfather's farm. He remembered hog killings from that time. He had been speaking to the Napiers about hog killings. They'd participated in them too from long ago. They had knowledge of how to do it, of how that would happen. But the Napiers themselves didn't have money to have hogs. So Adams had this idea and he had a hog bought and brought in. And then they do this, they kill the hog. They're going to use all parts of the hog for different things. And he creates this photograph, which again has this very kind of traditional composition. We've got that triangle happening in the center. Our figures are placed kind of evenly around it. Our attention is drawn both to the hog in the center. We see the head over to the left of John, who's sitting there. And he creates this very kind of traditional photograph with this piece. But critics who saw this photo said, well, this would be okay if it was labeled in some way as, a historic recreation of something that was done. But it's not, and it's presented in the 90s. And in that way, is it telling you something that is false? Is it giving you a false impression of what's happening here? And are the circumstances correct and true? And that seems to be kind of a grating against that sense that Shelby Lee Adams isn't really interested in being a documentarian. And yet sometimes that is the perception that's being brought to his photographs. Another family that Adams worked with quite a lot was the Childers family. He was introduced to them in 1976, and again, he photographed multiple generations. He actually introduced at least one couple in the family, so he was very involved in their family, very aware of them, and they of him too. He became kind of part of their lives. In their family, they have a couple of people that have developmental disabilities, and they were included in the photographs as well, including this one that you're seeing here, the Childers Kitchen from 1986. Particularly, you're seeing Homer there, who's standing at the kitchen table. Um, and this photo and others like it, when critics would see this photo, they said, well, it's reaffirming again these stereotypes that people have of this community, the otherness of this community, the idea that their poverty is their own fault because of generations of violence, allegations of incest, things like that, coming to bear on the photograph. But for Adams, when he was creating this photo, when he saw the photo, he was actually thinking of Homer and the way that his face is tilted up into the light. He was thinking of him as kind of this divine, saintly figure. He thought that was really beautiful and really striking in the image, and he wanted to include it. And the father there on the right, who's holding a knife in his hand, which also kind of complicates what story is being told, what's being communicated here. Well, that was a new knife, and it was something that he wanted to hold in the photo. So there is also this combination of Adams and what he's putting together into the photo, but also what his subjects are bringing to it as well. He talks about how he has a lot of gratitude for this family for learning how to become a photographer through working with them because they were very patient and accepting. And for the father there on the right, he's quite happy with the photos that have been taken. He's had positive quotes about those photos. And sometimes the critics, as they're looking at these pieces, they themselves can veer into offensive territory when they're considering these photos. Um, some will kind of go in the direction of, well, these are quite sophisticated photos. And do the people that he's photographing have the visual literacy in order to understand what the photo is communicating to the public? Can they give an informed consent if they're not able to understand what's really being communicated through the photos? But of course, luckily, there are other people who also chime in to say that that doesn't give these people enough credit. They're not stupid. They're aware of stereotypes. They're aware of modern media and how people from their area are being portrayed. So they're aware of these things. They know these things. Sometimes they lean into these things when they choose to. So these are all things that are going on. They're aware of all these different things happening as well. For Adams and how he chooses to work, because all of this is quite complex, he has kind of a careful working method that he uses. He spends 2 or 3 months each summer in eastern Kentucky, and his visit to a family might last several hours. He brings his 4x5 camera, his tripod, his lenses, and as many as 5 light sources, umbrellas, light stands, a meter, and yards of electrical cords. And his photo process is very much a collaboration with his subjects. He doesn't allow himself to photograph a family a second time until he's given them a set of photos from the first shoot. Then he'll ask to rephotograph some of the family and also ask for an introduction to others. So all of his connections are through personal word of mouth introductions. That family who's introducing him will sometimes also bring photos to show what he does so that the other family can understand it better. And he's realized that this is what works for him. It's better to work directly with the families rather than trying to go through like a governmental entity or something like that, where there's not as much trust in the system. So that word of mouth really works for him. During the shoot, he also makes Polaroids, which is an integral part of his process. And throughout the presentation, we've seen some different photos of him looking at these Polaroid photos with his subjects. So they'll look at this together, they'll change things, they'll add things. Maybe someone no longer wants to be in the photo, that's fine. It's a quite collaborative process. The shoot itself may be only 20 minutes or it may be up to an hour and a half. He doesn't necessarily consider the photos to be staged, but he does formally pose them. He wants his subjects to be aware that they're being photographed, and aware of how he's placing them within the photograph. He'll also give the subjects books and pictures when he comes back so that they're totally aware of what's happening with their image. When he started giving them prints, they would thumbtack them to the wall or scotch tape them to the wall, thereby lessening the value of those prints. So now when he has shows, he'll actually take some extra materials from those exhibitions and mat and frame them and sign them and clearly write the value. So they have it very transparently what that is, and then it can hang in their home. It's something that the families, aren't looking at as an investment, though, more so a keepsake of the family. These are their family albums. These are their family portraits that are on their walls, so they're quite special to them. And he, even though he's developed this kind of way of working, this method of working that builds a lot of trust with people, he still has to maintain and keep that trust throughout the entire process. If a family doesn't want a picture published, he doesn't publish it because he needs to maintain that trust. He also has files of thousands of pictures that he gives away, and that's something that he considers a service to the community. They're giving something to him by posing for these photographs, and so he wants to give something back. For him, the family is the priority rather than the culture or the art. So that's his kind of guiding principle throughout his method is protecting the family. So throughout, we get a sense of this very kind of curious tension. He's handling these things with a lot of care. He feels a lot of personal investment and attachment to the subjects that he photographs. They have a lot of personal significance to him as well. He loves these people. But at the same time, the final results can sometimes feel ominous, whether that's through the angle, the closeness of the subject, the theatricality of the lighting, the expressions on the faces of the subjects. All of these things come together to create very complex photographs. So today we've learned about Adam's life, his photography, the process that he uses. And so I leave it to you now to dig further into these photos and form your own opinions of them. See what you think. Do you agree with the critics? Do you understand where Adams is coming from? So take a look, dig in there. They certainly are this really interesting study in representation and identity, and perhaps a reflection not only of a community, but also of the photographer who's capturing them as well. So I will stop there and let me see if I can get back to stop sharing my screen, get back to the main screen and allow you to unmute yourself and ask questions if you would like, or write them in the chat. But are there any questions? I'm happy to answer. I'll also mention the documentary that I mentioned in the presentation, which was called The True Meaning of Pictures, Shelby Lee Adams Appalachia. It's available on Canopy, which is a streaming service that a lot of libraries provide free access to through your library card. So if you're interested, that's pretty accessible if you'd like to check it out. There's also a nice interview with Shelby Lee Adams, kind of an artist talk in the gallery um, about his work, and that's on the website of the Catherine Edelman Gallery, I believe. So check those out if you want to know more, hear more directly from him, from the artist. But any more questions for me? Otherwise, we can finish up. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. Be sure to tune in next month for Sean's next one night stand presentation, and keep an eye out for any of the rest of our public programs and Zoom programs as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.